Chapter 17. Schrödinger's cat, wanted dead and alive. Kenia was still tearful when she called her mother. She knew she was blabbering, sniffling, and sobbing between her breathless retelling of the past few weeks. Her episodes relayed in gasps of breath and desperate inquiries of, "Am I going crazy?" or "Have I lost my mind?" and "What is happening to me?" Her mother, her voice composed if not calm, replied simply, "Kenia, get out your computer, log in, and call me. I need to see your face while we talk, and I tell you what I need to tell you." Ominous words, but at least her mother didn't seem to think she was going crazy. At least not yet. Kenia braced herself as the computer booted, anticipating disclosure of some history of mental illness in the family. Bipolar, schizophrenia, something resulting in complete psychosis. "Mom, I don't want to be sick," she said into the phone. You're not. You're all right, baby. Just let me explain," her mother said in measured tones. "Don't hang up," Kenia said, sniffling, afraid to break the connection. "Baby, I'm holding on. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here." Then she was. Her mother's face, Kenia's own eyes staring back at her, her childhood home in the background. It was so familiar, so comforting, that Kenia sobbed anew. Her mother's expression looked fraught, despite the tone of her voice. Her hand trembled as she wiped away her own tears. She clicked off the phone now that they were face to face. Kenia did the same. "Mama, what is happening to me?" Her mother took a deep breath under closed eyes. It was the same mastering of herself she had done just before telling the four of them that their father was gone. It was the same expression she pictured her mother taking on in the privacy of a back room before going out to tell the family of a patient that, despite all available resources and best efforts on the part of the hospital, their son, daughter, father, mother, brother, sister, husband, or wife had passed. It could not be good news. "I guess the best place to start is your father." "What does this have to do with Dad?" "Everything, Kenia. Everything. Remember how your father disappeared? There was never a body." She did. She remembered how she had held on to the hope that it was some sign he was still alive. But after a time, it was just another source of uncertainty that turned to pain. She had never understood those families who described themselves as at peace once their loved ones' remains had been recovered, be it from a plane crash, a battlefield, or a murder scene. Sometimes long after the disappearance, until she herself had lost someone important, with no answers, no leads, just a void left filled with questions. "Yes," she said. "Well, in truth, I told you Daddy was dead, but the truth of it is, I don't know." "What?" Another deep breath on her mother's part as Kenia felt her heart beating rapidly in her chest, driven by anxiety or hope, she was not sure. "It was so complicated, Kenia, and when I finish, you will understand why I didn't tell you, or anyone for that matter. It was always a secret. Donovan wanted it that way." Kenia was silent, waiting for her mother to continue. "Kenia, honey, what I'm going to tell you is hard to believe, and I would not believe it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. But your father was a time traveler." It would have seemed like a joke if Kenia had not had her own inexplicable experiences. She asked her mother to go on. "I'm a scientist, Kenia. So was your father. So you've got to understand that neither of us believed it at first. We explored all the scientific, medical, psychological explanations we could. Hysteria, psychosis, schizophrenia, just like I'm sure you are already thinking. But none of it fit. And then I saw it with my own eyes. I watched your father disappear. One minute he was there, then he was gone. I panicked. I thought I was losing my mind. Then, after I searched the house, the yard, the garage, and I was about to call 911, he reappeared out of nowhere, right there on the back deck. Mom, is that what has been happening to me? Oh, baby girl, I'm so sorry I never told you. I couldn't tell you. You see, where would he go? The past. Always the past. But there were always crucial moments, turning points in history he had no control of when he would leave. The when he would journey to. But he was certain there was always some change he was supposed to make, a correction to a mistake, a historical injustice of some sort. He changed history? Yes, in little ways, but always for some greater effect. But how do you know once it's happened? It's hard to explain, but he learned to live with it, with the possibility of more than one timeline. He could sense when the jump was coming, so he would try to make sure no one would see him disappear and be alarmed. Once I knew, I would help cover for his absences. Over time, we both came to accept it. He looked for explanations, studying physics, space-time, and history. But the only tangible explanation came from his ancestry. In Africa? Yes. You see, your father came from a line of shamans. They were called Dibia in Igbo culture. Dibia? Yes, the religion was called Odinani, the supreme creator god, Chineke, Chi, being the spiritual connection with the supreme god, and that connection being stronger in some than others. For shamans, it could be so strong that they worked with Chineke to help determine the course of history. Chi, I thought that was a Chinese word. It means God in Igbo. It's right there in all of your names. Chiazam, Chikmara, Chinamuri. God has answered my prayers. God is wisdom. God is doing. Your name, Kenia Burrito, even if it is Ogoni and not Igbo, means as it pleased God. Her mother sighed. You and your friend Audrey took so much to Ashanti theology. I never really told you about your own Igbo people. But Mom, we're Catholic, and so is 60% of Haiti, while 100% practice voodoo. Your friend Audrey told me that. She leaned closer to the screen. Kenya, you have to remember, no one is just one thing. Kenya sniffed. She remembered her father saying the same to her so long ago. She breathed, composing herself as best she could. That's my girl. But Mom, what happened to Dad? Her mother's throat fluttered as she struggled with her own emotions. He disappeared. He journeyed back to somewhere, to some when, but did not return. Kenya covered her face. Was that her fate, too? She felt the tears returning. Kenya, honey, you need to be strong. I'm so sorry that this burden has come to you. It's a curse, but it's also a gift. You are called. You are called to help, to go back, to make things right. I don't want to make things right. I want to live a regular life. I want Dad back. Her mother was rendered silent, while Kenya cried out 5 years of yearning, loss, and sadness. When she was finished, her body exhausted from the spell, her mother was still there and said in an iron voice, I did not raise you to be regular, Kenya. I did not raise any of you to be regular, and you are not. None of you. I raised you to be extraordinary, to be resilient, to fight and to thrive. Despite the headwinds you will face, every night your father prayed that same prayer by W.E.B. Du Bois, the one that says, "Mighty causes are calling us, and they call with voices that mean work and sacrifices and death. Mercifully grant us, O God, the spirit of Esther, that we say, I will go unto the king, and if I perish, I perish. I perish." Kenya repeated the last words, contemplating the father-shaped hole in her own life. "He was willing to serve, Kenya," her mother said, the growing fear in her voice making it tremble. "But you don't have to perish. Be smart. Be strong. Be resourceful. Find friends whom you can trust. Learn about wherever, whenever you are being called to. And most of all, you come back to me. You hear me? You come back." There had been a fight at school, not the typical scuffle between young men too full of testosterone and themselves, the type of fight that opened with a prolonged period of shouting and posturing, followed by the exchange of a few strikes and blows before the combatants tumbled to the ground and grappled, so close that neither could do much harm to the other, and both secretly relieved when bystanders stepped in to break it up. No, this had been a fight between two girls, over a boy. It had spilled out of the girls' bathroom into the hallways, down a set of stairs, and onto a landing where one girl, Jennifer Retnash, was kicking at the other, Susan Howland, who was curled into a fetal shape, having given up even if her attacker had failed to acknowledge it. That had been when Chikmara had come upon them. She was halfway up the steps, on her way to trigonometry, when Jennifer cornered Susan. The thud of each kick on Susan's torso was terrible. For a moment all the witnesses stood frozen until Chikmara, disgusted by the violence and failure to help, stepped in. She had tried to protect Susan, throwing herself over her. Jennifer Retnash didn't like that. She grabbed a fistful of Chikmara's hair and dragged her off. Chikmara resisted, and that was the point that Mr. Miller, the civics teacher, rushed in, drawn by the screams and chaos. Arriving when he did, without context, he read the main fighters as Jennifer and Chikmara and tried to force the two of them apart. Jennifer reached past him to grab another fistful of Chikmara's hair, pulling her closer to knee her in the stomach. Mr. Miller, feeling Chikmara pulled towards him, mistook her movement as the lunge of an attack. He reached out with his arm and tried to brace her away. That was when the tufts of hair ripped out of her scalp and Jennifer's hand went free. Chikmara was thrown off balance. Mr. Miller's arm sent her flying backwards. There was nothing for her to catch herself on, as they were still on the landing of the stairs. Chikmara floundered, as if into a trust fall, without anyone to catch her but the descending stairs. She struck her head on the banister first and continued to fall until she landed, splayed out on the tile floor at the bottom. By then, the other teachers had arrived. Jennifer was restrained, a tuft of Chikmara's hair still in her fist. Susan Howland was tearful, bruised, but intact. It was Chikmara who had suffered the worst of it, the banister splitting open her head. It being a head wound, the stairs were covered in bright, oxygen-rich, almost fuchsia-colored blood. They carried Chikmara away on a stretcher and took her to the ER as a precaution. The truth of the incident eventually came to light as witnesses explained what had happened. Kenya had heard bits and pieces of the story all day long and was relieved when her father showed up at the door of her 6th period geometry class, a visitor badge on his chest, and called her into the hallway. Her first question was about her older sister. and she barely had it out of her mouth before her father reassured her.
Chigmara is fine. She got a couple of stitches. Her biggest concern is whether or not people will be able to see the missing patch of hair in the play next week.
Kenya remembered her sister was the lead in The Color Purple. She knew her sister. She had been in scraps with all her siblings at one time or another, and Chigmara was made of stern stuff. She would be fine. Of course, her sister was more concerned about the play. Theater was her life.
But we have something to do first,
her father said.
Come with me.
The period was almost over, so Kenya went back into the classroom, gathered her things, then followed her father. He walked the halls, lined with forest green lockers, as if he knew just where he was going. She realized that, of course, he knew the school. She was the third of 4 children who attended. There were debate trophies at the front entrance that China Marie had won over the years. Her dad had also been there for his share of parent-teacher conferences, but it was still incongruous to see him there, in this space of teenagers and teachers. It was not the place for her surgeon father, and was about as strange as those occasions when she would see her teachers out in the real world of the supermarket or the movie theater, living a seemingly real life. Her father, for his part, belonged in a hospital, in scrubs, or at the kitchen table, or in the pew next to her in church. It was simply weird and unnatural to have her worlds collide so, the boundaries and distinctions, so resolute in her teenage mind, blurred. Only something significant and unsettling could bring such a disruption about, and she didn't like it. A tremor of unease started in her chest when she realized where they were going. Mr. Miller's classroom. The stairwell at the end of the hall was still blocked off with yellow wet floor, piso mojado signs, as the custodian, a friendly brother named Reggie, cleaned up her sister's blood. Her father knew Reggie from pickup basketball games at the gym.
How you doing, Reggie?
Good, Mr. Donovan. How is Chigmara?
She'll be fine.
God is good.
Her father stopped before the open door to Mr. Miller's classroom. Mr. Miller was standing before the chalkboard. Posters depicting the presidents, the 3 branches of government, bicameral versus unicameral legislatures, as well as movie posters from historical dramas such as The Patriot, Gettysburg, Amistad, and Pearl Harbor were on the walls. Mr. Miller was a 30-something white man with a wife and 2 kids, 3 and 18 months. By all appearances, he was a decent guy doing a decent job. He was one of the more popular teachers. At the moment her father appeared, Mr. Miller was reviewing a quiz. When he noticed them waiting in the hall, he had a student from the front row take his place at the lectern and continue to read out from the answer sheet while students graded their neighbors' papers. Mr. Miller showed no surprise, his expression somber when Kenya's father introduced himself. Her father started right in, his voice low enough that their conversation could not be overheard by the students, but firm nonetheless. He did not ask about the fight, Chigmara's word having been enough for him. Kenya and her siblings knew better than to lie to their parents. Instead, her father spoke as if he had known what he would say long before.
There are a lot of kids in this school. Lots in your class there, he said, with a nod to the students just over Mr. Miller's shoulder. I have just 4, and that is all I can handle most days.
Mr. Miller nodded. Kenya could read the uncertainty in his face. He was not sure where her father was going. She had no idea, and listened, rooted in place. Mr. Miller was the soccer coach and had an athletic, if slender build, but he looked slight and undersized next to her father. Kenya was not sure why, but she felt an underlying current of tension building between the 2 men. Her father reached across the space between the 2 men and let his big hand settle on Mr. Miller's shoulder.
I never raise a hand to my children. Neither does my wife. No one does. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. There has been enough of that in this world.
Kenya was not sure what her father meant by enough of that, but she recognized that her father's touch was not friendly in this instance, but controlling. For the first time in her life, she saw that those hands that could put broken people back together could threaten to do the opposite, too. They could be menacing. Her father threatening. I have 2 more children who will come through this school. This here is one of them. The other is in junior high. Take a good look at her, because you will never need to lay a hand on a child with the last name of Desi in any way other than to protect them from harm. He turned to Kenya, surprising her. Did you hear that, Kenya? You won't ever be in a fight where Mr. Miller needs to restrain you, will you?
No, sir, she said without hesitation.
Dr. Desi, I certainly didn't mean Mr. Miller. I certainly was not finished, her father said, his voice a low rumble. I'll remind you, we are men. We are just as good as our sisters, just as smart, just as deserving. But nature has seen to it that we are stronger. It's our job to use that strength to protect. Nothing else. Her father's voice softened, almost to a plea. Do you understand? I do, Mr. Miller said. Good, her father said, clapping the younger man on the shoulder, then shaking his hand. Keep doing what you are doing. Yours is an honorable profession. I'd be nowhere without my teachers, but these children need us to rise above ourselves, to do our best. Her father's countenance changed back to the father she knew, genial and gentle, as he turned and smiled at her. Come on, Kenya. Everything is going to be all right. And so, apparently, I'm a time traveler, Kenya said in finality. She was at the kitchen table in the Pennells' home. After all, they had been the only ones to see the phenomenon firsthand. She owed them some explanation, and her mother had urged her to find allies. But after sharing what she knew, and sitting in the pregnant silence that followed, she felt like a fool, waiting for their reaction and wondering if her own partial explanations were convincing. Why did the backdrop have to be a kitchen of all places? So ridiculously prosaic, a setting for a testimony of ancestral gifts, spiritual beliefs, and the violation of the laws of space-time. But whether they thought Kenya a fool or credible, the Pennells didn't show it. Austin was impossible to read. Kenya imagined he was already contemplating where the nearest mental hospital might be. Shane looked straight out the window, his eyes unfocused. Stan's head was down, his brow furrowed as if in the throes of a difficult math problem. Haley alone was looking at her with a measure of compassion. She reached out across the table for Kenya's hand, took it in a firm grip, and showed no sign of letting go. Please, somebody, say something, Kenya pleaded. Stan spoke first. I can't explain it, but then again, if I could, I'd have a Nobel Prize. But I can offer theories. Wave function? Shane turned to him, a questioning look on his face. Yeah, it's the only sort of explanation I can think of that makes any sense, but there's still so much we don't know. So much of the physics are still being worked out, even now. So you believe me? Kenya asked, hope and relief mingling in her chest. Her stomach felt light. Yeah, of course. I mean, we all saw you disappear, Kenya. That doesn't just happen, Stan said. A tear escaped from Kenya's eye. I thought I was crazy. We didn't think you were, Haley said. Then we all would be. No, not crazy, Stan said. Not crazy at all. It's actually, well, you have to make a couple of assumptions that have yet to be proven in physics. But considering that we observed, such assumptions might be in order.
It would appear that for some unexplained reason, Kenya, you are jumping among different possible realities, different timelines, or different points on the same timeline before it diverges with others, Shane offered. We have no way to know that, Stan countered. Kenya tried to remember what she could of physics, but it was not much more than force was equal to mass times acceleration, Newton having 3 laws, and the relativity of time, but that was knowledge gained more from watching sci-fi movies than Mr. Edmund's high school physics class. Her AP classes had been in chemistry and biology, things she thought would help her with a major in public health. I know time is perceived differently depending on your speed. That's an old sci-fi movie staple. I do remember my high school physics teacher saying nothing can move faster than light. Correct, Stan said. That's all based on relativity, but what you are experiencing has more to do with what happens on an even smaller, subatomic level. This is where scientists turn to quantum mechanics, which is still being reconciled with relativity. But in quantum mechanics, it's not about the fixed position of a particle or the energy level of a wave, but rather the probabilities. Like statistics? Kenya asked. Sort of, Stan said, setting his hands on the table. You know the model of the hydrogen atom, the nucleus with the proton and neutron and the electron orbiting around it? Sure. And if the nucleus was blown up to the size of an apple, the diameter of the electron's orbit would be the size of Manhattan Island? The Big Apple, Shane said, a wry smile lifting the corner of his mouth. Haley rolled her eyes before he apologized. Sorry, serious time now. No more puns, I promise. It's all right. I could use some levity, Kenya said. Go on, Stan. Well, quantum mechanics says there's no real point that the electron is at any one time. There is just a region of probable locations, none of them fixed until observed. That region of probable locations is a sort of cloud of probabilities. And that has all sorts of implications for the nature of reality, Shane said. How so? Austin asked, displaying more curiosity than he had before. Stan continued. Well, the most famous thought experiment was Erwin Schrödinger's cat-in-a-box scenario. Not to be confused with Seuss's cat in a hat, Shane said. Shane, I'm going to murder you, Haley said. Sorry, I promise I'll stop, Shane said with a smirk, which he wiped from his face, mime-like, after another scowl from Haley. Stan tried to start again. See, Schrödinger hypothesized that if you put a cat in a box with a radioactive element with a half-life, let's say of 60 minutes, that means it would have a 50-50 chance of breaking down and releasing enough radiation to kill the cat in the span of 30 minutes or so. But at the 30-minute mark, before we open the box to check on the cat, in theory, both realities, the cat being dead and the cat being alive, exist in equal probability. Until we observe the state of the cat, Schrödinger would argue that the cat is both dead and alive. Your shirt from yesterday, Kenya said. Stan pointed at her, as if rewarding a point just scored. Yes, I'm a bit of a physics nerd, if you didn't notice. We noticed, Haley said. I'm not following, Austin said. What does that have to do with Kenya? Well, if the probability of where particles are and what they do determines reality, Stan said, we can extrapolate that there are nearly infinite possibilities for the trajectory of reality at every moment. Where science is split right now is whether or not all those possible realities collapse into one, the one we experience, or if they split off into different ones, different timelines, different universes. It's where the theory of the multiverse comes from, Shane added, finally serious. There is scientific evidence that these possible universes do interact and that somehow governs the expression of the energy levels of particles or their wave function. But like Stan said, no one knows yet if they collapse into one observable universe or if they split off. How do you know all this? Kenya asked.
Shane and Stan are geeks. It's genetic, chronic, and incurable. Haley sighed.
It's sort of a hobby of ours, Stan said, bright-eyed and undeterred. You can learn a lot from YouTube science lectures. And MOOCs. MOOCs? Austin asked.
Massive open online courses, Haley said. It's actually where I learned a lot about camera work, lighting, and editing.
And I thought the Marine Corps had too many acronyms.
See, Kenya, we're not just pretty faces, Shane said, framing his face in a square made of his fingers. It reminded Kenya of Audrey, and this time she did laugh at his antics. Stan cleared his throat and brought them back to the subject at hand. Perhaps, after what Kenya said about her father, how he was always called back to critical points in the past, one could theorize that these points are nodes, where a number of possible realities converge and branch off again. They could be important, so important that some force, be it scientific or something more metaphysical that we don't understand, a force of will, a force of wanting, an arc towards justice for all we know, is drawing Kenya, like her father, to go back, to make something different.
To make something right, Haley said. How do we learn more? Kenya asked.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know, Austin added.
Stan and Shane shared a look between them before Shane shrugged his shoulders and said, "We do what any good scientist would do." Stan finished his brother's sentence. "We observe." Chapter 18. A Lesson Before Dying. Haley or Stan accompanied Kenya on her remaining interviews that week. She explained their presence to the respondents by introducing them as her assistants. The residents of Selah Station whom they interviewed did not mind. Some were actually eager to meet young people, and more than a few had heard of their YouTube channel, even if they did not know what exactly YouTube was. Hal Olson, a 92-year-old widower whose gas station had stopped pumping gas in 1997, spent more time asking Stan about the internet and how it worked than he did answering Kenya's questions. He was in no hurry to do anything else. His days consisted of waking up at 6 a.m. and heading across the street to the station, where he put on his mechanic's hat and read the paper to kill time. As Kenya and Stan left, walking out to Kermit, Stan was sober. "He just reads the paper all day to pass the time. These same articles over and over. The man doesn't even have a flip phone. What kind of existence is that?"
It's not much of one, but I've realized it's sort of common up here where there are no jobs. It's good he's not turning to drugs or alcohol.
Cole is not coming back, Stan said. People need to stop talking about jobs and start paying attention to workers and their skills, he said, staring up at the ridge of Manahawk Mountain looming over them.
But how is he going to learn new skills? How is a MOOC supposed to reach Hal when he doesn't even have a flip phone, much less dial-up? She said, pulling on her helmet and buckling the strap beneath her chin.
I don't know. I'm not a politician.
You are an educator of sorts, though, she said.
Yeah, he replied, looking off into space. He put his arms around her waist as she kick-started the engine and they accelerated away. With most of the interviews finished, Kenya set up a station in the panel's control room. While Haley edited their latest videos, Shane made calls organizing extras and emailed them scripts, and Stan posted on social media. Kenya transcribed, reliving the dozens of interviews on porches, in dining rooms, and kitchens all over Selah Station and the surrounding hollows. She checked in with her mother multiple times a day. At night, Haley came home with her to the Corrigans, sleeping on the couch in the upstairs apartment. The 4th of July came and went. There was no grand municipal display of fireworks. The city could not afford it. But under an indigo sky, they gathered with the residents of Selah Station to eat barbecue chicken and apple pie, while a Back to the Future marathon played out on an outdoor screen.
Neighbors set off fountains and children ran about with sparklers, dazzling in the night air that was already full of laughter and patriotic music pumped from speakers on the gazebo. Kenya could almost see how present-day Selah Station resembled the old one. Families still had children, and children still played the way they always had. But it did not take much further reflection to realize the crowds of today were so much smaller and far less diverse than the ones she had seen in the decades before. And even this crowd did not account for many of the residents of the city and its environs. Few of the people she had interviewed were actually there in the downtown square, unable, unwilling, or uninterested in joining in the community spirit. The days of transcribing wore on. When Kenya needed a break from the dark control room, she would take her laptop and station herself on the porch. Austin had set up 2 of his sawhorses there, and was planning the wood siding he had decided to replace. After transcribing a particularly tedious and depressing session, an interview with a woman who had lost her last job 15 years before when the last mines had shut down and now made her living, scavenging aluminum cans from the side of the road, recycling them for 45 cents a pound, Kenya looked up at Austin, studying him and his work. She envied the straightforward nature of his task. He paused to run his hand along a board, closing one eye and studying its face. "You are quite precise," Kenya said. "Yeah, I guess I am," he said, without looking up from the grain of wood. "Always have been a fan of order, ever since I was little. My mother said I used to stack the soup cans in the grocery cart, even as young as 2. Labels out and according to color." "A little OCD?" "Maybe," he said without a smile. "Got worse after our parents died." Kenya waited a moment before she asked, "What happened?" "Car accident. Drunk driver crossed the center line. They died instantly." He walked away. "I'm sorry." Austin blew the wood shavings off the face of the board. "Yeah, so were we. They were good people." "Who took care of you all growing up?" "Our Uncle Mike, actually. He lives up in that house on the back of the lot with his wife Rochelle. They didn't have kids of their own, took us in. Uncle Mike owned this place, but turned it over to us as we got older." "Austin, do you think he was the person I saw when, I jumped back last time?" "I had been thinking that myself," he said, laconic. "Could I meet him?" "Not unless you go to the Florida Keys. He's down there with Rochelle, brushing up on their scuba diving skills." "Scuba diving? How old is he?" "In his 80s. But he's well preserved. Him and Rochelle both. Iron Mike, they call him around here." He returned to planing the wood. "So you've done all the renovations here?" Kenya asked. "Yep. It's the kids that bring the money in. I sort of work for them." He brushed shavings from the hair on his forearms. "Not sure what else I would do around here. I'm good with my hands. I'm organized. The Marine Corps taught me how to kill people and disable IEDs. But those are not marketable skills in Selah." "All this stuff in the yard must make you a bit crazy." "Like you wouldn't believe," he said, chuckling for only the second time since she had met him. "But it keeps them out of trouble. There are worse things they could be doing in these parts." He stopped, balancing the plane on its corner as he spoke. "It's funny how folks think this is the real America. I served next to guys from downtown Phoenix, the backwoods of Oregon, suburbs of Indianapolis, New York, Newark, and Miami. All those places were just as real as rural West Virginia. Not as white, but just as real. I don't know why places like this are such an obsession." "Nostalgia?" "Seems like hooey to me." Kenya sighed. "At best, that picture of the past is ignorant. At worst, it's racist." "I feel like a lot of these folks around here, they have never seen New York City, Miami, San Francisco. They need to.
Otherwise, they'll keep thinking that America is supposed to look like the cast of the Brady Bunch. They need to get out, meet some people like yourself, shake hands with a middle-aged lesbian, have coffee with a Muslim, see that America is a place where all these people can be at home. Freedom of faith, respect for all, malice towards none, and all that.
Kenya thought back to Joel Anderson and the wall of the cost of living he had described surrounding cities. Sometimes travel itself is a privilege.
So are ignorance and indifference, but they shouldn't be. I don't know, seems to be that everyone at once is more lucky than they deserve and more worse off than you can imagine. If we could just realize that about everyone, maybe we could get out of each other's hair.
Austin grew silent after that and lost himself again in his work. Kenya in hers, but it was a companionable silence they shared. Later in the afternoon, when it was too hot to work, Austin went inside, changed shirts, and returned with iced tea lemonades for both of them. He settled into a rocking chair and drifted in and out of sleep, an Ernest J. Gaines novel in his lap. Stan took over for Austin before dinner, keeping an eye on Kenya while Austin cooked. They set themselves up at the kitchen table. It was late in the day and Kenya was having trouble concentrating. When news broke that a white man had rammed a car into a crowd of anti-white supremacists, marchers, in Charlottesville, Virginia, everyone's phones started to buzz with updates and posts at once. Kenya and Stan stopped all their work and began reading, watching, and listening to reports online. Kenya felt sick, like something putrid was rolling in her gut. Her vision was blurred with tears of outrage.
This country can't seem to make it through a summer without racial violence, she heard Haley say from the studio. Apparently, she was not getting much work done editing new videos either. Can't make it through a day is more like it, Kenya thought bitter.
The president has notably not condemned the white supremacist protesters. Instead, he is calling for the bigotry, hatred, and violence on many sides to stop,
Stan said, his eyes scanning his laptop screen back and forth, a note of disbelief in his voice.
Seems to me there's a side that wants peace and justice and a side that doesn't.
Austin growled from where he was at the stove. He shook his head.
We all know which side he is on.
He knocked a spoon against the side of one of the cooking pots.
Y'all sure you want to keep reading that stuff?
Not really, Kenya thought to herself, closing her laptop and putting her phone on silent. She found herself staring at the deception sticker on the back of Stan's laptop. She needed something superfluous to distract herself.
You really like the Transformers,
she said. Stan shrugged. He seemed to understand she needed a change in conversation and obliged her. They all were feeling the frustration and fury of being far away and powerless. He closed his laptop.
It's a bit absurd, but they are my favorite. And in the end, our civilization may be one perpetuated by artificially intelligent machines. I get tired of the same mainline Marvel and DC plotlines anyway.
Yeah, so does my brother.
Suddenly deeply grateful for Stan and his willingness to indulge her.
Don't get him started on how superior Dark Horse is.
He's right, you know.
Kenya, trying to avoid a lecture similar to one she had heard before from Shiazam, shifted.
I noticed you had a lot of the classic toys from the 80s at your workstation.
Yeah, Austin had a bunch and I got the others from collectors on the internet.
My older sister had lots.
Really? She wasn't playing with Barbies, My Little Ponies, or Strawberry Shortcake back in the 80s?
No. Gina Murray wasn't really the type who was into dolls.
I like her already.
She passed them down to my brother. He was into the comics too, but I couldn't get into them and how they kept going back with different series and making the origins of the Autobots and
Decepticons different. I know what you mean, he said, sitting up, but they were all variations on the same theme, some better than others. They got more interesting the more Megatron's principles of freedom, equality, and revolution evolved, and with how they informed Optimus Prime's own ethics. Tied together more closely, learning from one another, it made the story better. Did you like the new variations post Michael Bay? Hated them, he said, putting his hands over his head. Oversimplified it. Just all good versus all evil. So, how do you know what storyline to invest in? She asked, as Austin began to set the table around them. Well, it happens all the time, doesn't it? With rebooted origin stories, Stan said with a shrug. But all the best myths get recycled, and nothing is new under the sun, right? Shakespeare was right, and so was Joseph Campbell when he said it again. Even the Gospels had 4 versions. It was Kenia's turn to shrug. I guess you're right. Austin served dinner. They tried to avoid talking about the news. Afterwards, Kenia headed back to the Corrigans with Haley on the back of Kermit. Colton came by the apartment and they read to him until Sandra retrieved him to put him to bed. It was a calming relief to lose herself in a children's book. As she and Haley got ready for bed, Kenia was starting to wonder if all the precautions they were taking to observe her were necessary. Had they overreacted? She worried the Pennells might even begin to doubt her story. The longer they went without an incident. She had to admit, however, she slept better knowing Haley was there. Haley, for her part, relished the time away from her brothers. Together, they painted their nails and flipped through issues of Ebony. It was the first time Haley had looked at a black magazine. I never realized hair was so complicated, she said. I mean, this classification system with letters and numbers, it's surreal. Kenia drifted off, Haley still flipping through back issues. It was not until 1:12 a.m. that Kenia sat up in bed, the sensation growing in the space just behind her eyes. She pressed the pads of her fingers to her forehead and reached to shake Haley, but she was already awake, clicking on the lights and flipping on her phone's camera. It's happening, isn't it? Yeah, Kenia said. Here! Haley tossed Kenia a pair of jeans and a button-down plaid shirt. You don't want to show up pre-sexual revolution in your Victoria's Secret shorts. Everyone will be wondering why your ass says, I love pink. Or why my ass says anything at all, Kenia said, changing quickly, sliding into the jeans and pulling on shoes. She looked up to thank Haley, but she was already gone. Chapter 19. The latest in smartphone technology. The bedroom had been replaced by the darkness of night, the familiar sound of crickets, and cicadas closing in on her like a wave. Kenia had appeared outside, standing in a street. Thank goodness there's no traffic. The time of night she had jumped to lined up with the time she had left. The quiet of the street and the darkness of the windows told her it was late at night, likely past midnight. The sound of insects was distinct but soft, as in the small hours of the morning. For that reason, she imagined it would not be a good idea to knock on any doors to ask for help. Instead, she decided to use the cover of darkness and the relative quiet of night to explore, at least until she jumped back. She noted that she was less panicked during this episode. Perhaps having heard an explanation from her mother and the affirmation from the Pennells gave her some security that her sanity was not completely lost. If she ignored the cars and the yards, the neighborhood was unchanged. The houses appearing as they did 60 years in the future. They provided familiar and helpful landmarks. The 3-story Victorian on the corner of Delaney and Harper was recognizable. The Lutheran Church on Gardner Street was nearly identical to its 2017 version. She noted the parked cars she passed, Chevys, Fords, Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, even a Studebaker and a Packard. No imports, of course.
The hum of AC units was noticeably absent. Windows were open. While passing a few houses, she could hear the snores of sleepers inside. The sidewalks remained empty and her confidence grew. She moved towards downtown, passing quietly under the street lamps, surrounded by clouds of night insects tapping against the glass. At the intersection of Craft and Meacham, the red, yellow, green traffic lights had yet to be put in place. Only a single flashing red blinked into the empty streets on all four sides. She jaywalked from one corner to another. When she saw a newspaper stand outside Dawson's Hardware, she sped up. The tools in the window of the hardware store were not electric or especially sleek, but the wrenches, hammers, and screwdrivers had a solidness to their heft. She directed her attention to the newspaper dispenser and was rewarded. A single issue from the day before remained, although in the light she could not read it. She reached for her cell phone and stared at it with more than a little disbelief, recognizing that it was, without doubt, the most sophisticated piece of technology on the planet at that moment in time. She used the flashlight app to shine it into the stand. Saturday, August 15th, 1953. President Eisenhower rebuked senators for the time they were taking to debate a bill already approved by the House. There was an ongoing strike in France to protest austerity measures. Unrest in Iran. Locally, a youth group had set a record for collected donations for canned goods. Preparations were ongoing for the celebration in honor of the Selah Station troops returning home from Korea. She took a picture of the addition, feeling suddenly vulnerable and exposed after the bright flash. She scanned the street. No movement, no change. Save for the blink of the stoplight. She moved quickly anyhow. This was the longest any jump had lasted, and she was grateful for the opportunity to gather information, while at the same time her heart fluttered with panic at the thought of being trapped in this time pre-civil rights, pre-women's liberation. The 50s were hardly halcyon days for everyone. Yet Selah Station had prospered. At that very thought, she took her bearings and turned towards the island proper, the idea of exploring downtown in its prime drawing her. As she moved block by block, she realized that this Selah Station on the mainland was indeed only the outskirts. The park that would become the heart of downtown in the 21st century, where they would watch Back to the Future, was still just a wooded lot. In this period, the buildings became more distinguished the closer she moved to the Selah Branch Bridge. A train whistle sounded off in the hollows, and in the silence that followed, she could hear the sound of the rapids and currents swirling at the bottom of the river gorge. No roadblock, no guardhouse waited for her at the crossing, only the bridge, its girders freshly painted. This truly was a sleepy town, as there was no late-night traffic. She was able to cross walking down the center line. When she was halfway to the island, the train whistle echoed through the hills again, this time closer. Kenia realized the train was rumbling along the bend in the river to the north. With another blast of the whistle, its headlamp blinked into view as it made the turn upriver and chugged towards the bridge. She recognized the scene with a rush. "I've been on that train trellis in previous jumps." Grateful not to be racing away from an oncoming locomotive this time, she continued on the Selah Branch Bridge, taking in the surroundings. She turned back to note the Bridgewater estate, anchored up on the hill, looking down like a feudal castle, even in this time. The outline of the mansion was indistinct in the darkness, but she could make out the lights of a few windows, dim but sleepless eyes. 2 headlights appeared at the start of the bridge, just as she was crossing to the island. Out of instinct, she scrambled off the road and waited. She had not been sighted yet, but preferred the anonymity of invisibility. She pushed through a thicket of bushes, experiencing a sort of frisson to think that she was actually on Selah Island without a suit, followed by sadness that this place, so tranquil, would soon be rendered uninhabitable. The peace of this night, taken for granted by the sleeping residents,
students, faculty, and families ensconced in their bedrooms. The university, she knew, would be a place she might fit in, if she still remained after sunup. She might be able to pass as a student on the integrated campus, but first she would have to wait for this truck on the bridge to overtake her. It was moving with painful slowness, so slow, in fact, that she could see men, evenly spaced, walking beside it. Strange. She could not afford to squander time in the bushes when she did not know how long she had before she jumped back. But the growing presence of the machines of industry, the slow-moving truck with its escort of men, the train rattling its way on the trellis, its light blinking between the struts, gave her a new idea. She needed to see the plant. It was a place off limits in the future, but now, tragedy had yet to strike. She had a growing sense that whatever was drawing her back to this time, this place, had to do with what would happen there in the coming days. She shuffled out of the bushes and sidled down the shoulder of the road until she was certain she was lost in the shadows, beyond the reach of the truck's headlights. She darted to the opposite side, jogging north until she came to an intersection. She had been to this place with Octavian. In the future, the turn was sealed off, but now, this night in 1953, the road was as open as any other. A sign indicating that the SSCPP, the Selah Station Coal Processing Plant, was 0.25 miles distant, helpfully pointed the way. The gate to the plant was nothing more than a booth, the lights off, and a traffic barrier, which was down. The barrier looked as if it was raised just by hand. She was fairly certain she heard the faint sound of someone snoring in the booth. There was no fence surrounding the plant, however, so she took to the woods and approached the perimeter. Despite the hour, the plant was alive with activity, the noise of machinery drowning out the sound of her footsteps crunching through the deadfall. Floodlights illuminated the conveyor booms of the stackers as they piled up mountains of coal, which rolled out of the roaring machinery housed in the white, windowless plant. A tippler and a reclaimer crane moved the coal from the mountainous stacks to a row of freight cars likely pulled into place by the same locomotive she had seen crossing the trellis. In a few days, this will all be a smoking ruin. Could she warn them? Could she avert disaster? Should she? What would it mean to change history? She had no idea what to do, so instead she watched, noting men and even a few women moving about the grounds in coveralls and hard hats. When they walked close to the lights, she could indeed see that they were of all skin colors. She had no idea how much time had passed until the truck from the bridge rolled up to the gate, having finally covered the distance from the bridge to the plant at its slow crawl. One of the men escorting the truck knocked on the window of the booth. A light flicked on outside, shining on the truck, its escort, and its trailer. A short, thin man, could have been just a teenager really, stepped out of the side door of the booth, adjusting the oversized hat on his head and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He and the lead man from the truck's escort exchanged a few words and documents before the guard raised the arm of the gate and waved the truck through. Just as the truck shuddered into gear, a whistle sounded at the plant. The roar of machinery spun down. Lights began to click off throughout the plant while men and women retired from their posts, their shifts over. Only the reclaimer continued its work, pouring a steam of coal into the waiting train cars. Kenia watched a bus pull up outside one of the outbuildings, which the workers entered in coveralls, but excited shortly after in their civilian clothes, toting lunchboxes, the orange tips of cigarettes glowing in their hands and at their mouths. They boarded the bus, their voices indistinct, but the sound of laughter and camaraderie unmistakable as they hand-rolled more cigarettes while they waited, sharing them with one another. When it was full, the driver cranked the engine, and the bus rolled out of the traffic circle outside the administration block and disappeared towards a gate somewhere at the north end of the plant. Everything was still and quiet, save for the rumble of the tippler and the hiss from the reclaimer as they filled one coal car after another. Now the truck at the gate nearest to Kenia started forward with its escort. The lights of the plant had gone dark, except for a few along the driveway making aprons of light that danced over the long, gleaming tank pulled by the truck. The cab itself, now that she could see it, was a square design that could tip forward to reveal the engine. She had only seen its like in pictures. The driver's compartment looked narrow and cramped compared to the rigs she knew. The tank that followed, however, gleamed with the same silvery exterior and dimensions of modern gas trailers, with ExxonMobil, Shell, or BP emblazoned on their sides. The driver continued to move the delivery with extreme care, the men tracking alongside. The garage opened up to reveal a few workers waiting to meet them. Accompanying the workers were 5 guards, each with a Doberman pinscher on a short leash. Unlike the workers she had noticed earlier, these men were all white, not a black man among them. Whatever was being delivered had to be valuable, she decided. Hadn't Octavian and all the warning flyers and legal releases named it? Chlorotro something. It had exploded during the fire, and it was the toxic fallout that rendered the island off limits. Was Kenia witnessing its fatal arrival? If so, she wondered, with new urgency, what was she supposed to do? This burden of time travel was so new. What would her father have done? Had he made the wrong decision at some point, and that was why he had never returned? If nothing else, she knew she should document. She slipped her phone from her pocket and held it up, zooming in on the image with her fingers. Her mind was astir, marveling once more at the mere presence of her smartphone in the current era, while also noting her growing tension, the tightening of her back muscles, and the irritating discomfort of sweat running down her temples into her eyes as she waited for the camera to focus. With so much running through her head, she did not think to turn off the flash. The dual-color LED flash on her phone, advertised as the most advanced source of lighting available on mobile phones, promising better skin tones for people of all shades, did its job too well. The guards did not fail to notice the handy, staggered flashes, a feature to reduce red-eye, nor did they hesitate to release the Dobermans, sending them barking and howling in the direction of the flash. Kenia cursed, clutched the smartphone in her hand, and went crashing through the bushes and undergrowth. During her approach, the woods had offered plentiful coverage from view. But it was a space bereft of hiding places that would be safe from Dobermans with their canine sense of smell. All she could do was run, but even that was fruitless, she knew, as the noise she was making only made it easier for the dogs to track and gain on her. Her knowledge of what guard dogs were trained to do to colored interlopers in these times was informed by old stories from the South and black and white photos of dogs set on civil rights protesters. She ran with her heart in her throat, branches whipping her face and body. She was prey without a plan, and her only thought was to run. The river was not far, but the drop from the cliffside might be fatal. Even if she survived the impact on the water, she would have to negotiate rocks and strong currents in the dark. No, jumping was not an option. She stumbled and careened into a tree trunk, hitting her head so hard that she saw a flash of light. Dizzy, she scrambled to her feet and kept running, the dog shooting through the foliage just over her shoulder. The inevitability of her capture became clear. She knew it was only a matter of minimizing injury, if she could. She switched tactics, no longer looking for a path of escape. Instead, she searched for a tree with limbs low enough and thick enough for her to climb. None of the immediate contenders offered both. The nearest dog was so close that she could see its teeth gleaming in the faint light from the plant. She picked a maple with a low fork just within reach, hoped that her upper arm workouts would pay off, and hopped up, grabbing hold of the branches and pulling. Her time at the gym's climbing wall helped her. She remembered to use her feet, pushing herself just out of reach as the dogs swarmed the base of the tree, their jaws snapping inches short of her shoes. It was a stalemate, only delaying the inevitable, she knew. But at least she did not have to contend with dog bites, although what these men might have in store for her made her shudder. She wondered how long she could remain treed. Could she make it to morning? Who were these men anyway? Would they call the police? She ran through scenarios to offer as possible explanations for what she had been doing, her mind working better now that she was no longer fleeing. I'm a student from the college, and RA even. They will be looking for me at my dorm soon enough. She considered her phone. Would they search her? How could she explain it? They would search her for a camera, not a phone. She held down the power button and turned it off. At best, she could pass it off as... what, a toy? She slipped it into her bra, against her breast. It would look lumpy, but in the darkness, perhaps it would go unnoticed. If things progressed so that one of them actually felt it there, she knew she would be in a whole different universe of problems. The security men came into the clearing, their faces shiny with sweat, and stomped through the fallen branches and bushes, kicking aside thorny vines and sweeping the clearing with the beams of their flashlights. Kenia could see that they were all armed. She realized she might have less time than she thought. They raked the branches of the maple with their lights. Kenia pressed herself against the trunk, even though she knew it was ultimately pointless. Just when she thought all hope was lost, a new avenue of escape opened. A growing pain, which had never been so welcome, just behind her eyes. Could she accelerate it? Could she bring on the jump? She closed her eyes and clenched her fists, willing the phenomenon to manifest. One of the men shouted. He had seen her. Her eyelids flashed red with the beam of a flashlight. "Someone is up there!" But that was all she heard before the voice was cut short.